So next week, welcome Reverend Jessica and family. Reverend Jessica, I'm doing a little spoiler alert here, but I think it's okay. She's doing the movie Inside Out. Have you seen it? I may be the only one in the room that hasn't seen it, but Reverend Sally has said such great things about it. I can't wait to watch it this week. So we're going to go from Hotel Rwanda, genocide in Africa, to animation. It is animated, right? Inside Out. So if you were here 2 Sundays ago, you know that we talked about some tough themes, tough issues that created some conversation over the past couple of weeks. And if you remember, in my sermon I mentioned that you might hear some things from me that might be outside of your experience, or you might hear me say some things, and when it comes to these things, you just see them from a totally different perspective. Totally different light. And that's okay, it's good. It's what it means to be community. And I also invited you to, if you find yourself in that place of disagreement, that you would walk with me in grace. And some of you actually took me up on that invitation through emails, conversations in my office, conversations over coffee. And for that I say thank you. Thank you. And I also have to be real honest with you. My first impulse was not thank you. My first impulse, when things get a little hard, when things get a little dicey, my first impulse says run. Go the other way. Don't get in the middle. Don't deal with the hard conversations, the hard things. And then this thing crept up. Maybe you've had it happen before. Don't be vulnerable with them. Don't be vulnerable. Because you know the thing about vulnerability, right? The more vulnerable you are with people, the higher chance you have of getting hurt by people. And the flip side is also true. The more vulnerable you are with people, the higher chance you have of actually getting to experience the depths of human relationship. The depths of the good things that this world has to offer, the depths of the good things that God has for us. But it's not easy, is it? It is not easy. One of the things, the most valuable things I've learned in my work with the 12 steps is the power of showing up to your life. Just the power of showing up. It's half the battle. It's more than half the battle. Just show up to your life. But I suspect most of us, when it comes to the heavy things, those times of confrontation or conflict, most of us, most of the time, can somehow muster up the courage and strength to actually push through and get to the other side. Not always, and not everyone. And for lots of us, it's a growing edge. But you know when it's really hard to show up? It's hard to show up when there's suffering involved. It's hard to show up when you get that unexpected phone call. It's hard to show up when you get that unexpected diagnosis. It's hard to show up when you lose a loved one unexpectedly. It's hard to show up when your world's been turned upside down and your heart is shattered in a million pieces. And man, the things we do to try to avoid and ignore the suffering that's right in our midst. So my friend Quentin, beside me here this morning, serves as a reminder. We can't ignore the things that are happening right in our midst. And sometimes we'd rather, wouldn't we? So let's just be honest. Some days it's easier to actually stay in bed, isn't it? Some days it's easier to disconnect. Disconnect from the most meaningful things, the most meaningful relationships, the relationships that are most loving and most supportive. It's easier to disengage. And the thing is, we have the freedom to do it. God gives us the freedom to disconnect. And when we do, we can avoid some of the pain. We can deflect it, escape it. But also, when we disconnect, we avoid some of the most beautiful things this world has to offer. What are the things that keep us from showing up to our lives? What are these things? What are the things that keep us ignoring suffering? What are they? And you know, sometimes I think it's something simple like thinking we don't have the power to show up. We're not good enough. We don't have what it takes to actually show up. So there's this great passage in Matthew's Gospel where Matthew, chapter 18, Jesus is teaching his disciples about what it actually means to be a disciple. And he has all sorts of teachings. And in the middle of this teaching, Jesus just drops this bomb, this conversation stopper. And he says, "Truly I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." I see the look on your all's faces. You're thinking, how exactly is this a conversation stopper? I don't even know what it means. So let's put a little context to it. We have to back up to the Torah. For these first century Jews, the Torah was everything. They believed that the Torah was the way, the truth, and the life. And by following the commands found in the Torah, this was the way that you found the most full life that God was able to offer. And keep in mind, in the Torah, there's over 600 commands. And the Torah, it's the first 5 books of what we now have as the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And in the Torah, you'll find commands like keep the Sabbath and don't work on the Sabbath. Honor your parents, eat kosher, love your neighbor as yourself. And so when it came to Torah, it raised all sorts of questions. And here's how some of the line of questioning would work. Heated debates around these commands. And here's how it would work. Take, for example, the Sabbath. So how exactly do you define work? If my neighbor is in need, can I help my neighbor? Oh, I can't. Well, then if I don't help my neighbor and it's on the Sabbath, am I not breaking the command to love my neighbor as myself? And so what happened is over time, these religious leaders emerged, these people called rabbis. And rabbis came along in the first century, and they helped people understand what it meant to follow Torah. They helped people understand what it meant to be God's people in the world. And rabbis, here's the thing about rabbis. They each had their own set of interpretations and teachings. Each of them would emphasize different commands. And a particular set of teachings and interpretations was called the yoke of the rabbi. So stay with me. When a rabbi would come along and say to a student, "Come and follow me," and if that student said yes, the student would be putting on the yoke. Do you remember a particular rabbi who said, "My yoke is light"? Now, when the rabbi started teaching about what was permitted and not permitted on a particular command, when the rabbi started saying what was allowed and what wasn't allowed, this process was called the process of binding and loosing. So if it wasn't allowed, the thing was bound. If it was allowed, if it was permitted, it was loosed. Go and do this thing and do it to the best of your ability. So, do you see what's happening here? Jesus is saying to his disciples, you have to show up. All I have is yours. I've given you all I have. You actually get to make some decisions now. You get to make interpretive decisions. You get to show up and figure out what it means to be my people, and you get to help others figure out what it means to be my people in the world. I mean, do you see how huge this is? Bring it into our world. How many religious people do you know that grew up in a church or a denomination or a ministry, or they had a pastor or a priest who did all of the binding and loosing for them? And it created this atmosphere of just give me the answers. Just give me the answers. Tell me how to do it. Just give me the checklist and I can turn it into a checklist. And when there's pain and suffering involved, then you see the thing really creep up. Oh God, I'm suffering. Step in and fix it. Just tell me how to do it. Step in and make this right. And do you see Jesus' message? You get to do the binding and loosing. You get to figure it out together. All I have is yours. you have to show up to this thing called life and faith. And sometimes it's really hard to show up, isn't it? And let me just say this briefly. Actually, I'm going to let Quentin nail, because suffering has a way of stopping us. Sometimes the act of sitting with those who are suffering, sometimes that is the bravest and most courageous thing you can do. That is what it looks like for you to show up. To simply sit. Not to offer solutions, not to offer answers. And in fact, there's a beautiful thing in the Jewish tradition. It's called sitting Shiva. Sitting Shiva is when you have a loved one who dies. Other loved ones will come into your home for 7 days, and they'll just simply sit with you in your mourning. Sometimes it's the most courageous thing you can do. And if you're in the position right now where your world has been turned upside down, where your heart has been broken into millions of little pieces, sometimes the bravest thing for you to do, perhaps showing up, is in a sense asking people to sit Shiva with you, to be present in your suffering. And here's the thing about showing up. When you show up, you actually inspire others to show up to their lives. Because ultimately, in the end, it's about using your story, your negative turns, your times of when it was hard, those times of pain and suffering, using those things to actually inspire and bring about healing and hope into the world. And so let me bring you back to Hotel Rwanda, Paul Rusesabagina. He was a man who knew how to show up. He allowed his pain and suffering to inspire others towards healing. He allowed his story, the things going on inside of him, the things going on around him, allowed that story to persuade him to stay present with those who are suffering. So you're going to see two short scenes here. The first one is where Paul has just found out the other nations aren't coming to help. They are in it alone. And so he uses that to inspire others. Then the screen's going to go black for a couple of seconds because it fast forwards in the film, about 36 minutes. And you'll see a second scene where Paul had the opportunity to go to safety with his family. And certainly if he did it, no one would blame him, no one would fault him, but his story, again, persuades him to stay with the suffering. Here it is. I don't know about you, but I find all sorts of hope and comfort in a Jesus who had the same impulse that you and I often experience. You might remember there was a time in his life where he was walking the way towards the cross, towards his own execution, and he stops in this garden called Gethsemane. And he prays, Father, if it's at all possible, let this cup of suffering pass from me. Don't make me go through it. If there's a way out of it, give it to me. Thank God Jesus showed up to his life. Thank God Jesus showed up to a cross. And you all know about a cross, right? It's a first century execution device that was invented by the Roman Empire as a statement to show you what happens if you defy the Roman Empire. And here's how it would work. And keep in mind, the Roman Empire, huge empire, a military superpower, massive. It dominated the world roughly 2,000 years ago. And here's how it might work. Some Roman soldiers would roll into your town or village, and they would begin asking you a series of questions. Who is the Son of God? And you were expected to say Caesar. Who is the Prince of Peace and Lord of Lords and King of Kings? Caesar is Prince of Peace, Lord of Lords, King of Kings. And if you answered correctly, you'd get a pat on the back and said, good, you're one of us. We will protect you now, but you must pay us taxes, and we will build our military superpower so that we can continue to protect you. Now, if you were clumsy enough to say something like, Jesus is Lord. Or Jesus brings peace, and it's not through violence, it's through justice. And Jesus is King of Kings. Well, then you might just find yourself hanging on a cross in the middle of the city. And the goal of the cross was to cause the most intense pain for the longest period of time possible. So if you just hung on the cross and died right away due to pain, it would be a failure. And equally, it would be just as much of a failure if you hung there for long amounts of time, for days, and you just kind of died slowly of starvation or lack of water. The goal was pain and suffering. So isn't it peculiar now that the cross, as seen as a symbol of hope and healing? I mean, think about it. I was just talking to one of the ushers this morning. He's in the back with the blue shirt, the other blue shirt. And he tells me he's getting a tattoo this week. I said, awesome, what is it? He says he's getting a cross with a heart in it. Some of you have crosses tattooed on your bodies. I do. Some of you have crosses hanging in your homes, in your offices. I do. Some of you wear crosses around your neck on necklaces. Strange, isn't it? Because no one is wearing an execution chair. No one has hanging in their office a guillotine. But we do have crosses. How did this happen? The early Christians took this image and they turned it on its head. Because for these early Christians, the heart of the Christian story was the insistence that God is not distant, detached, or somewhere else, but that somehow God is present right here in the midst of the worst kind of human suffering. That's where God is. Elie Wiesel, who just passed away yesterday, the Holocaust survivor, when he explained the Holocaust and people asking, where's God? Where's God in this? God is right here in the midst of the worst kind of human suffering. That's where God is. The cross is God. God being very vulnerable in our world. A God who could have turned and walked the other direction. A God who could have ignored the pain and suffering. But instead you get a God who is vulnerable enough to step into the pain and suffering of this world, to enter into it with us. Oh, but God, you don't imagine. You don't know what it's like. You weren't there when I got that phone call. Or God, you don't know what it's like when I walked into that hospital room. Or you don't know what it was like when I got this kind of news. Or you don't know what it was like to watch this system of injustice actually kill people. And the cross is God saying, I've been there. Me too. That same system put me to death. Oh, but God, you don't know what it was like. I've been there. I've walked that path. It's why one of the early Christians was able to talk about the cross this way. If I can have the slide, please. And he reconciled all things to himself through him, whether things on earth or in the heavens. He brought peace through the blood of his cross. The God of the cross calls us to enter into each other's pain and to bear one another's burdens. What are the things that keep us from showing up? And so at this time, I will invite Reverend Sally and Reverend Jessica to lead us in communion. By the way, one of the most significant reminders we have of God's presence with us and God's love that is always with us. And my friend Quentin here has been building a cross. Can you help me lift it? You know, I asked Quentin this week, I said, man, I need someone to build me a cross. I said, but here's the kicker. You only have 20 minutes to do it. And look what he's done. So after communion, yeah, we can clap for that. Can you grab the box? After you take the bread and the cup, I will invite you to visit one of the two tables. So yeah, it's going to get a little messy with people being around, and that's okay. Suffering's messy. Visit one of the tables, there's Post-it notes, multicolored Post-it notes with a Sharpie next to it. Because one of the things we've done with this film series is we're covering the cross with all sorts of color with our scrims. So I invite you to, after you partake in communion, you color this cross with your Post-it note. Write down a word or a phrase. Engage in the question, what are the things that keep you from showing up? If it's fear, name it. If it's fear of rejection or not being liked, name it. If it's immense amounts of pain, if your heart has been torn into a million pieces, name it. What are the things that keep you from showing up? Write it on the Post-it, post it to the cross after you take communion. And as always, anytime we do stations, you're not required to do this. But if you'd like to, you're invited. Amen.